The Last Call. At 7:38 p.m. on May 5, 1999, Debbie Griggs made a brief phone call to her sister-in-law. The call went normally. Two plans were to be presented to a group of student advocates for the rights of mothers and young children that morning. They had agreed on a time, paused briefly, and then hung up. Neither of them knew that it would be the last time Debbie spoke to a family member. According to documents, just hours after that call, she was murdered in her home, where she lived with her husband and 3 young children. Debbie Griggs was 34 years old. She was a trained nurse and the mother of 3 young children. The oldest was 6, the second 6, and the youngest was less than 2. At the time, Debbie was pregnant with her 4th child. Those who knew Debbie often remember her as a hard-working, dedicated woman who always put her family first. Before marrying, she chose nursing because of her desire to care for others. According to the information presented in the revised version, this career choice was not just a calculated decision, but shaped Debbie's entire life. Those who worked with her, and are still moved by her descriptions, describe her as warm, loyal, and egalitarian. Debbie grew up in Deal, a coastal town in Kent, southeast England. Her family had been close for generations. Relatives lived nearby, frequently visiting and supporting each other when needed. After marrying Andrew Griggs in 1990, Debbie believed she was beginning a new chapter. Andrew came from a family with a long tradition in the local frozen food business. On the surface, many people see him as a hard-working businessman and a responsible person. The two of them run the family business together while raising their children in their small home in Deal. But behind that facade, cracks began to appear in their marriage. According to documents used in court, Debbie repeatedly felt disrespected in financial and family decisions. She claimed Andrew treated shared assets as his own, often prioritizing his personal interests and leaving Debbie to bear most of the responsibility for childcare and housework. During the births of their first 2 children, Debbie suffered from postpartum depression and actively sought treatment. Records show she stopped taking medication in 1995, and by the time the case was tried, the court concluded that she was no longer clinically depressed. This detail later became particularly important because Andrew repeatedly used Debbie's medical history to explain her disappearance. By the end of 1998, the marriage was once again in crisis. According to the court's conclusion, Andrew had a relationship with a girl around 14-15 years old and became obsessed with her. Debbie began to suspect him, confronting him repeatedly, but he denied it. Not only that, Andrew openly flirted with this girl in front of his wife, putting further pressure on Debbie in her own home. In early 1999, Debbie announced that she was pregnant with her 4th child. Instead of rejoicing, Andrew reacted violently. According to the case file, he demanded that Debbie have an abortion and even suspected the child wasn't his, although the court later ruled that these accusations were completely unfounded. While the marriage became increasingly strained, Debbie also began to seek ways to protect her rights. Because the family company was jointly owned, she kept the company's checkbook as a way to ensure she wouldn't be excluded from managing the finances. According to sources close to her, Debbie understood her legal rights and did not want to leave empty-handed. Just days before her death, a series of events unfolded. Andrew attempted to open a new business account solely in his name, effectively neutralizing Debbie's financial control. Simultaneously, a witness later testified in court that Andrew had expressed a desire for his wife's death in a property dispute. On the evening of May 5, 1999, all the marital, financial, and extramarital conflicts seemed to converge. Less than 4 hours after her last phone call with her sister-in-law, Debbie Griggs disappeared. For 23 years, no one knew where her body was. And throughout that time, her husband steadfastly defended a story that the court later concluded was untrue. When a missing person starts to have too many conflicts. On the morning of May 6, 1999, Debbie Griggs failed to show up for her appointment with her sister-in-law. Initially, family members thought she might be busy caring for the children or had an unexpected errand. But as the day progressed, the unease grew. This wasn't like Debbie. According to family members, she always kept her promises and almost never left the house without notice, especially while pregnant and caring for 3 young children. This unusual silence quickly made the family realize something was wrong. When police began their investigation, the first person they contacted was Andrew Griggs. He told investigators that his wife had left the house that night after an argument. According to Andrew's account, Debbie left voluntarily, taking a few belongings with her and not specifying her destination. That was the initial explanation. But from the very first hours, investigators discovered several points they couldn't ignore. If Debbie truly left voluntarily, why didn't she contact her parents, siblings, or close friends? Why would a mother who always put her children first leave 3 children behind without a word? And more importantly, why did she disappear completely, as if she never existed? These questions quickly shifted the direction of the investigation. Officers began searching the Griggs family home. They documented the scene, collected evidence, and reconstructed the schedule of each family member on the night Debbie disappeared. At the same time, they interviewed relatives, neighbors, and people who had been in contact with Debbie in her final days. Through these testimonies, the picture of Debbie and Andrew's marriage gradually became clearer. Many said that Debbie had shared that she was no longer happy. Conflicts over money, business management, and Andrew's extramarital affairs caused increasing tension in their family life. All these aspects are reflected in the case documents. For the investigators, this wasn't incriminating evidence, but it helped them understand the context before Debbie disappeared. In criminal investigations, context is always crucial. It explains why an event might have occurred and helps determine which lines of investigation should be prioritized. In the following days, police continued to review financial transactions, the family business, and changes that occurred immediately before Debbie's disappearance. They discovered the marriage was under considerable pressure. According to records, Debbie was also trying to protect her financial interests in the joint business, while Andrew was making moves to spin off the company in a different direction. At the same time, the search for Debbie was expanded. Areas surrounding her residence were checked. Friends and relatives were asked to provide additional information. However, time passed without any sign that Debbie was still alive. No calls, no letters, no bank transactions. No witnesses confirmed seeing her after the evening of May 5th. This was highly unusual for a pregnant woman with 3 young children. Investigators began to consider a disturbing possibility. Perhaps Debbie hadn't left of her own accord. Perhaps her disappearance was connected to a crime. However, to turn suspicion into legal charges, they needed more than speculation. They needed evidence. And the process of gathering evidence over the following years became one of the longest and most complex investigations in the region. Testimony would change. New details would gradually emerge. And after more than 2 decades, a pivotal discovery has opened the biggest turning point in the entire case. 23 years of silence and a turning point in the investigation. In the first few months after Debbie Griggs disappeared, investigators conducted a series of searches. They checked vacant lots around Deal. They reviewed the routes Debbie usually took. They interviewed relatives, friends, colleagues, and people who had been in close contact with her just before she disappeared. But the results were still zero. No one saw Debbie after the evening of May 5, 1999. No bank transactions, no activity from personal documents, no indication that she had started a new life. According to the case file, as time went on, the likelihood of Debbie voluntarily leaving her family became increasingly unlikely. She was pregnant, had 3 young children, and maintained very close relationships with her relatives. However, proving a murder when no body is found is always a major challenge. Investigators understood that suspicion couldn't replace evidence. They needed compelling evidence to explain what really happened. Years later, the case file remained open. It was reviewed periodically when new information emerged or when more modern investigative methods became available. Investigators continued to examine Andrew Griggs' testimony. They compared what he said at different times with the documents already collected. According to the records, some details in Andrew's testimony had changed over time, causing the investigative team to continue questioning the reliability of these statements. At the same time, the police considered the family's financial situation, disputes related to business operations, disputes concerning property, and also the alleged extramarital affair that Andrew was accused of before Debbie disappeared. The individual elements may not be enough to draw conclusions, but when combined, they helped investigators better understand the context of the case. For them, this was no longer simply a missing person case. It was a protracted investigation with many unanswered questions. Time passed. 5 years, 10 years, then 20 years. Debbie's 3 children grew up without their mother. The family never gave up hope of finding the truth. Neither did the investigators. They believed that, no matter how long it took, every case could offer a new opportunity. And that opportunity finally came. According to the case file, more than 2 decades after Debbie disappeared, police received new information crucial enough to expand the investigation. These facts led them to focus on an area that had never been fully explored before. A large-scale search was launched. Specialized equipment was brought to the scene. Forensic experts worked meticulously on every inch of land. For many involved in the search, it was more than just a professional mission. They understood that after more than 20 years, Debbie's family was still waiting for answers. And then, what they had been searching for over 2 decades finally appeared. According to the case file, Debbie's remains were found in the search area, marking the biggest turning point since her disappearance. This discovery allowed forensic experts to conduct analyses that were previously impossible while the victim was still missing. For the family, it was a moment of both pain and relief. Pain because the hope that Debbie was still alive had ended, but also relief because they finally knew she had been found. After years of waiting, the investigation now entered a completely different phase. New forensic evidence, new expert opinions, and the entire case file, built up over more than 20 years, would be brought back before the justice system. This time, prosecutors believed they had sufficient grounds to bring the case to trial. And in the courtroom, the jury will have to consider the entire chain of evidence to answer the question Debbie's family has been waiting for 23 years. What really happened on the night of May 5, 1999? Cases and evidence verified over more than 2 decades. More than 23 years after Debbie Griggs disappeared, the investigation has finally reached the stage her family has long awaited. The case file is being presented to the court. For prosecutors, it's not just about proving guilt. They also have to explain to the jury why a case that had gone unsolved for years finally has sufficient grounds for prosecution. From the beginning, the prosecution has emphasized that the case is not based on a single piece of evidence. It is the result of thousands of hours of investigation, multiple rounds of file review, and a combination of witness testimony, financial documents, forensic evidence, and new information that emerged after Debbie's remains were found. These events fit together in the sequence described in the case file. The jury heard the entire account in chronological order. From Debbie and Andrew's marriage, the ongoing family conflicts, Debbie's pregnancy with her 4th child, disputes over property and business, up to the night of May 5, 1999, when she made her last call and disappeared without a trace. According to the prosecution, considering each event individually may not be sufficient to draw conclusions. But when arranged chronologically, the picture of the case begins to emerge. Successively, several witnesses were called to testify. Debbie's relatives recounted their last conversations with her. They described Debbie as someone who was always devoted to her children and family. According to their testimony, her sudden abandonment of 3 children without contact was completely contrary to her character and lifestyle. These testimonies did not directly identify the perpetrator, but they helped the jury better understand the victim's circumstances before the crime occurred. Next came the investigators' presentation. They explained why the investigation lasted for years, why some testimonies were reviewed multiple times, and what led the police to decide to expand the search after more than 2 decades. According to the records, it was the new information and the discovery of Debbie's remains that allowed forensic experts to conduct more crucial examinations that were previously impossible. The defense presented a different argument. They argued that the long period between Debbie's disappearance and the trial required a very careful evaluation of the evidence. According to them, witness memories can change over time, and all conclusions must be based on verifiable evidence. That is why both sides spent so much time analyzing every detail in the file, every testimony, every timeline, every document collected throughout the investigation. For the jury, the task wasn't to choose which story sounded more convincing. They had to determine whether the entire chain of evidence was sufficient to substantiate the charges according to criminal law standards. In their final argument, the prosecution stressed that Debbie was not simply a missing person. According to them, the entire evidence showed she did not voluntarily leave her life. There were no signs of preparation to leave, no contact with family, no activity indicating she had started a new life. Conversely, the defense continued to ask the jury to consider every other possibility and carefully evaluate every piece of evidence presented in court. After days of deliberation, the judge finalized the jury instructions. The doors of the deliberation room closed. Debbie's family waited in silence. The investigators waited too. For many of them, this was a case that had haunted them for much of their careers. Finally, the jury returned to the courtroom. The verdict was announced, closing one of the longest investigations in the area and establishing Andrew Griggs's criminal liability as stated in the case file. For the justice system, the trial was over. But for Debbie's family, there was still a long way to go in learning to live with the loss after more than 23 years of waiting for the truth. Facts after 23 years and Debbie's legacy. A verdict may end a trial, but it cannot erase more than 23 years of waiting for a family. When the final verdict was announced, Debbie Griggs' relatives said very little. For them, the journey began with a short phone call on the evening of May 5, 1999, and only truly ended when the truth was revealed more than 2 decades later. During the years Debbie was missing, her 3 children grew up without their mother. They lived with unanswered questions. What happened to their mother? Why didn't she return? And would the family ever know the truth? These are the questions that followed them throughout their childhood and into adulthood. For Debbie's parents and siblings, that period was also a never-ending search. Every time new information emerged, hope was rekindled. Every time the investigation stalled, they had to wait. The only thing they never gave up was their belief that one day Debbie would be found and the person responsible would face justice. According to the case file, the discovery of Debbie's remains marked a decisive turning point, helping forensic experts and the prosecution complete the missing evidence to bring the case to final trial. For the investigators, the Debbie Griggs case was proof of a crucial truth. Time may make the investigation more difficult, but time does not mean the truth disappears. Advances in forensic science, review of records, and the perseverance of investigators can create new opportunities, even for cases that seem to have been forgotten. During the trial, prosecutors also emphasized that the entire conclusion was not based on a single piece of evidence. The verdict is formed from many different factors: witness testimony, documents related to the marriage, forensic evidence, and new findings during the expanded investigation. Only when all of these are combined does the picture of the case become clear. That is also the core principle of modern criminal investigation. Not conclusions based on emotion, not conclusions based on speculation, but based on evidence that has been repeatedly verified. Looking back at Debbie's life, many people don't want her to be remembered only as a victim of crime. According to the information in the records, Debbie was a nurse, a mother of 3 children, and pregnant with her 4th when she disappeared. Relatives describe her as devoted to her family and always trying to care for those around her. That is her true self. Not the news, not the court proceedings, but she was a woman with dreams, a family, and unfulfilled plans. The Debbie Griggs case also offers many lessons about protracted investigations. There are cases that cannot be solved in weeks or months. Sometimes it takes years for new witnesses to come forward. Sometimes we have to wait until technology is more advanced. And sometimes it is the persistence of those who refuse to give up that makes all the difference. Today, this case is still frequently mentioned in real-life crime investigation programs in the UK as an example of how justice can come late, but it can still come. Behind every investigation file is a family waiting for answers. Behind every verdict are years of irreplaceable loss. And behind every solved case lies the persistent effort of many who refuse to let time bury the truth. If Debbie Griggs' story leaves one message, it's the value of perseverance in pursuing the truth. 23 years is enough time for a child to grow up, enough time for many people to retire, but not enough time to erase legal responsibility when the final evidence is revealed. Thank you for following the entire Debbie Griggs case. If you are interested in real cases, evidence-based investigations, and the long journey to find justice, please continue to follow us in the following episodes. Each case is a reminder that behind the files are the lives of real people, and every truth revealed has meaning for those who remain.